I want to welcome everybody to this first 2025 virtual lecture from the Friends of Fort Hunter. We're delighted that you could join us. I'm Barbara Dennison, a member of the board of the Friends of Fort Hunter, and we are delighted to have our lecturer tonight, Glen Dunbar, who is also a member of the board of the Friends of Fort Hunter, here to speak with us about Victorian funeral customs. We know that overlaps the era when the Rileys lived at Fort Hunter, so I think a lot of people are very interested in this topic. I want to let everybody know that this lecture will appear once the recording has been turned into however that works on the Fort Hunter website at forthunter.org. That's all one word, Fort Hunter and then .org. So that'll just be in a few days. Also, if you're registered for this lecture, you'll get an email with the link to it, so you'll be able to watch it again. Usually we have questions and answers in the chat function. If you can see a chat function at the top, we'll be using it. If not, we might get it there by the end of the lecture. I'll let you know. We're using different platform this year, which is from the Dauphin County Commissioners, Dauphin County Parks and Recreation mandated the platforms we use. So we hope we can get that sorted out while the lecture is going on. A couple things to remind you of. We do have you muted, and if for some reason you become unmuted, mute yourself again, because we want to all be able to hear Glen, our speaker. The Fort Hunter Garden Fair, always a popular event, is coming up on May 4th. That's Sunday, May 4th, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And there'll be lots of plant sale and Susquehanna folk music and cake walking and maypole dancing and a lot of other things. So come on to that free event and bring a few dollars for the vendors and the concession stand. But we would love to see you at Fort Hunter on May 4th. We also have an upcoming virtual lecture from the manager of the Eichelberger Tavern at the Eichelberger Distillery at Dill's Tavern in Northern York County. Some of you might have been familiar with that site and that recent opening of the tavern, and the distillery at the tavern. And we know that whiskey was distilled at Fort Hunter, and there's a connection between the McAllisters and the tavern there. So hopefully we will get a date settled pretty soon, and we will be publicizing it for you to hear about that. And now I'm very happy to bring to you Glen Dunbar, who is a gerontologist, semi amateur historian slash professional historian for the Dauphin County Historical Society, and as I said, a member of the Friends of Fort Hunter board, and he is going to share his talk with us, and we are delighted to have him tonight. Thanks, Glen.
Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen right now, and thank you all for tuning into this. I think you will like it. Okay. All right, we're talking about the funeral customs in the Victorian era, and that was really the Gilded Age of funerals. And it's noted for a number of things. One is just the ostentatious mourning customs, but also the food, also the transition and changing of what cemeteries were all about, and it really sparked a booming industry at the time. Now, a couple disclaimers. What I'm going to be talking about is factual, all right, but it's not specifically about funerals at the mansion at Fort Hunter. Yes, if you go over to the mansion and you get one of the wonderful tours, they will talk about many of the things that I talk about because the practices were similar, but my research encompasses a wider range of places and things than just the mansion. Now, the other thing to keep in mind is that my academic disciplines are sociology and anthropology. So those are the perspectives I'm going to be talking from, which is a little bit different. If you're a historian, you probably would not say some of the things that I would say as a sociologist. So I think the first question that comes up was, when was the Victorian era? Well, officially, it was the reign of Queen Victoria from 1837 until her death in 1901. But for our purposes, for purposes of understanding the Gilded Age of funeral customs, think Civil War to the Great Depression. And this was a real trending kind of sociological event. And once you get a trend going, it doesn't just stop on a dime. It continues for a while. So what were the reasons? Why the heck did funeral customs and death become such a big concern during this era? Well, number one was Queen Victoria herself. She was the trendsetter. She was the social media influencer, and she elaborately mourned the death of her husband, Prince Albert, for 40 years. So that was one reason. Another reason is that this was during the time of the Industrial Revolution, and that brought prosperity for many, many people. And elaborate funerals sparked a lucrative industry. And at least for the people who had the money, conspicuous consumption related to death was an in thing. Another reason was most Americans and Europeans were Christian, and these elaborate rituals fit into the church's message of heralding the joyous journey that someone who died was going to be taking in the afterlife. And then another reason was this was a romanticized period in many things, and certainly romanticizing death was a thing that was touted. So here's a picture of Queen Victoria shortly after Albert's death in 1862. Now, Queen Victoria was, by the way, the first cousin of Prince Albert, although that doesn't have any direct bearing on the funeral practices. But he died at 42, and she declared that this mourning period should be the longest in modern times, and she actually commanded the royals to wear mourning dress for a full year, and she herself wore mourning dress, this kind of black dressing, for 40 years until her death. And these mourning clothes were actually called weeds at the time. Don't ask me why. It's just something that was. Now, psychological reasons for this preoccupation with death. Well, this was a time that society was rapidly changing, and whenever there's a rapid change in society, people look for ties to the past. They want some stability, and so ties with the deceased is a way for achieving some stability and psychological slowness for individuals. Another reason was that death at this point in time came usually unexpectedly, and the rituals and the extended mourning period helped slow down the shock of death. And the third reason, psychologically, is that at that point in time, people were really curious. Britain ruled the world, and it was exploring new frontiers all across the globe and exploring death and the afterlife as a new frontier fit right into that kind of mindset. A gerontological note I'd point out is that death back then was different than it is now. In the Victorian era, death came mostly to young people because most people did not live long enough to die old. So now most people who die are 75 years of age or older, but not then. Only a few people 75 years of age or older were the ones dying because only a few made it that long. So death often came quickly and unexpectedly back then. And now death is different because often it's preceded by years of declining health. Although people still are surprised when they die, but that's a whole different story. So there are some philosophical questions that I think are raised in our study of Victorian funeral customs. One is, when is a person dead? Now you'd think this would be a mundane kind of question, but it's really a deep philosophical question that's been around for thousands of years. And there are several different kinds of definitions about when a person dies, depending on your philosophical orientation. One is death occurs when breathing stops. Another is death occurs when the soul departs and goes into the afterlife. And a third is when no one remembers the person. And a fourth is when the person's name is no longer uttered. So that's kind of heavy, but those questions have been around a long time, and we'll talk about how they're reflected in Victorian customs. Another question is there life after death? And certainly Victorian customs were all about that. They very soundly believed that there was life after death. And then another interesting question is whether sins can be absolved after a person dies. And we'll look at some things about how that comes across in Victorian customs. So for starters, there weren't so many funeral parlors or hospitals for people to die in back then. So death and the viewing took place in the homes of individuals. And here's a picture of fairly common upscale kind of parlor that the dead person's body would be displayed in for a few days anyway. And take a look at some of these very common artifacts. First of all, you'll see the black curtains. That was a mainstay. And notice there'd be a picture of the individual, black crepe on it. And over here, that's a mirror. And the mirror is covered up with black cloth because related to the superstition that maybe when the person's soul died or when the person's body died, the soul is still left around a bit. And you didn't want that soul to get caught up in the mirror. And so you would cover the mirror, and you'd also open the windows. And you'll notice here on the bed how comfortable that is. that was a change from previous decades, something new to make the corpse comfortable in death. Now, something you don't see around here, there probably was a little bowl of salt somewhere because people believe that salt kept away evil spirits. Another thing you often see in Victorian homes is a coat or hat or some other kind of shrine. It's not apparently a shrine, but it really is, because that's left in place for decades to show the continued, ongoing presence of the individual, even though the body is gone. There were two essentials for every Victorian funeral. One is the mourning handkerchief, which was good for dabbing the eyes of the bereaved, but it was also good for having a dab of perfume put in it, because remember, now we're going back before air conditioning, and you have this body upstairs in the parlor for a few days. It's likely to have some odor developing with it. So the perfume oil and the cloth, they were pretty much essential for the individuals participating in the viewing. Here's another photo that illustrates the elaborate use of flowers. And we think, oh, gee, that was back in, 1860, 1870. Where did all these flowers come from during the wintertime? Well, they had a good floral industry going back then, and they had greenhouses. And at least for people who were rich enough, they were able to get flowers all year round. And that was a mainstay of Victorian funerals. Lots of white flowers were favorites. Here's a shot of an outside of a house, and you'll notice the house is draped with black cloth and a black banner. That was to announce to everybody in the world that there'd been a death in that household. And so it was a good way to advertise the death, and very, very common practice. These black wreaths on the door, that was a mainstay. And I was on the internet just the other day, and you can still buy black wreaths from Etsy and get it shipped to you if you want to have a black wreath. Now, some popular superstitions of the time. Feathers and feather pillows can trap the soul. So when a person was on his deathbed, lots of times they would remove any feather pillows or any, the quilting made of feathers and things of that nature, because nobody wants to trap the soul. And a second one was, well, you keep the doors and windows closed when the person is in the process of dying, because you don't want to allow any evil spirits to come in. But then as soon as the person dies, you want to open up the windows a little bit, and you want the doors to be open, so if the soul is floating around, it can find its way out and make its way to heaven. And another popular superstition was that when a person was on their deathbed, they might say something profound. They might tell you about what heaven looked like, or they might talk about having finally come to accept Jesus And if they did that at the deathbed, then all of their sins in their past life could be absolved. And so people would sit around the deathbed waiting for the individual to utter something of great significance. And this actually was a problem because sometimes people were so interested in hearing the dying person say something profound that they would deny them pain care. You know, back at that time, you could buy morphine without any prescription. Most houses had a little bit of morphine, a bottle of morphine stuck in the cabinet. And so it was possible to relieve pain pretty easily. But if you want the person to stay as awake as possible in order to say something profound when they died, you wouldn't give them the pain medication. Now, there was definitely a proper death etiquette, and a fashionable death required certain apparel. No doubt about that. So this comes from a book, an etiquette book, and for widows it says full mourning for a year, veil over the face, no ornaments, second mourning period, after the year was up, another 9 months, and then they can pull the veil back and so on. There was a process to be followed, and there were many accessories to for the fashionable widow to participate in these customs. It sparked a whole industry of clothing design and seamstress. It also, in that second mourning period, there was jewelry for people to wear. And I get a kick out of some of the jewelry because a lot of the rings look like biker rings look right now, with skulls and crossbones and skeletons and things of that nature. But that was not for bikers, that was for fashionable widows to wear. And this is from a newspaper ad. Everybody likes a good sale, and this is about a sale on mourning clothes. And you know, you might as well stock up. You're not supposed to wear the same mourning dress to more than one funeral. That's bad luck. So, you know, the smart shopper would stock up and get these supply of different wedding or mourning dresses while the price was good. And men as well as women followed a dress code. They wore top hats and black suits and things of that nature. I threw this in. This is a picture of the Dock Street sisters down in Shipoke. I did some research of history there. And these were a couple sisters who lived on Dock Street when it still existed in Shipoke. And they mourned their father's death for about a decade and walked around the streets of Shipoke dressed like this for quite some time. Now, the corpse itself, it wasn't just the widows, but the corpse, the dead woman, had fashionable dress as well. Often, the dress for the corpse was made from the woman's wedding dress. And if not from the wedding dress, then at least it had a lot of white associated with it. Now we're coming into something else here, a heads up. Again, remember what I said about death being different then. Death was mostly about young people. And so young people were very much a part of the Victorian era death practices. And maybe this was a good idea, this Let's Play funeral advertisement. And they had dolls that were supposed to be dead baby dolls for the young children to play with and pretend that they were giving a funeral for them. And they could give the baby doll the last rites and things of that nature. I really like this hymn from that time. One day, dear children, you must die. Though you are young and healthy now, within the grave your limbs must lie, and cold and stiff your bodies grow. Okay, to us that sounds pretty macabre, but back then it was important to get children involved and used to the concept of death, because after all, their brother or sister disappears, and they had to have an explanation. There's something else that came into existence then, actually before then, but it was big at that point. Art Morindi, that's art related to death. So jewelry and belts and other things were often made from the hair of the deceased. And you could wear this, these hair lockets and whatnot, and stroke it a little bit. And that would help you stay in touch with the deceased. Remember, I told you, there's one philosophical belief that you don't die until no one thinks of you anymore. So having these kinds of artifacts helps people stay in touch and keep the deceased person around. Here's a shrine, making globe-type shrines. That was fairly common. Here's a paperweight that was made during the era, and this, of course, was made from the hair of the little girl. You see the photographs there. She had luxurious hair, and you braid that and make that something that they could keep close to themselves as a reminder. Okay, now a heads up on the next few slides. This was a Victorian era thing of photographing the corpse in lifelike positions. So you might find this disturbing. Here, just take a look at a couple of these. Prop up the guy, lay the baby out on the sofa in the love seat. Here's a photograph of a mom and the child that she lost, and there's they're holding up probably I don't know how old she is, in her 20s anyway. Now you'll notice how odd the eyes look. That's because when they took the photographs, they would close the eyes of the individual, the corpse being photographed. But then later on, an artist would paint the eyes back onto the photograph. And oftentimes they didn't get it quite right. So you have a lot of really weird looking things. And they photoshopped photos even way back in the 1860s, 1870s. Here's a photo of a mom, and there is supposed to be the spirit of her deceased son looking over her shoulder and keeping an eye on her. So I never thought they photoshopped back then. Funeral processions were very elaborate, and who walked in which order in the procession, that was very carefully scripted. Think of weddings now and how people put out the name tags on the different tables and things of that nature. Lots of thought goes into who sits next to whom. Well, this was like that in terms of the funeral processions. They put a lot of thought into it. And when an important person, well, when anybody died and had a procession, the commoners were lined the streets very respectfully and stood there with their hats off until the procession passed. And these funeral processions were quite a social event. You notice the carriage had the glass type carriage so you could see the deceased in the coffin inside of it. It sparked a whole new industry as well in terms of making these special carriages. And they went so far, not so much in the US, but in England at least, there were mourners who were hired to follow the procession and look grim. They were called mutes. And this is what they looked like. This was the official garb of a mute. And they carried this big stick with black cloth on it. And they didn't smile. They just kind of plodded along. And they were considered to be the dredges of humanity to have a job like that. But, you know, people paid for it. So it was a kind of job. Funeral cards, that was another big industry. And sometimes the funeral cards would be quite elaborate, quite expensive. And you get them printed up pretty quick and you go and deliver them to individuals that you want to come to the funeral. And if you got one of these cards, you had best come to the funeral and pay your respects, because if you didn't come to the funeral and pay your respects, you would be haunted. Funeral biscuits, another new industry. Bakeries had their own recipes and own special funeral biscuits, and they sold them in large quantities. And at least, I don't know that people really believed it or not, but at least it had ties to, if you eat this biscuit, then you're digesting one of the transgressions that the deceased made during life. And so you were going to lighten the load in terms of helping the individual get into a good place in the afterlife. Funeral biscuits were a definite, even among poorer people, they had funeral biscuits. So a bite to eat, also some wine, not a lot of wine, but a small glass of wine, a bite of something to eat, and also a little bit of salt. They were mainstays in most funerals. And it probably has some connection to some ancient pagan customs, but we really can't go there. Just know that wine and a bite to eat were always around. And if you had money, which most of these people had, you'd better put on a good spread for the funeral, because you didn't want to be remembered for having a skimpy funeral luncheon. You want to be remembered for having gone all out. And they even had cookbooks just for what to serve at these funerals. So new businesses of all types sprang up during this Victorian period. And of course, once the businesses sprang up, they did their own marketing and it built on each other, and one thing led to another, and just this preoccupation with funerals and death got bigger and bigger. Now, one of the trends during the Victorian period was the trend from coffins, this is a coffin, to caskets. This trend started before the Victorian era, but certainly it picked up speed during that era. You notice the coffin is six-sided, but the casket is not six-sided. It gives the deceased person more room to wiggle around in and be more comfortable after death. You know, it's nicer. It's also a great deal more expensive. So that was a trend. Another trend was from graveyards to cemeteries. Now, most people today use those terms interchangeably, graveyard and cemetery, but they're not. A graveyard is affiliated with a church. A graveyard is consecrated holy ground behind the church where people get buried. And for hundreds, if not thousands of years, that's the way most good people were buried, was in a graveyard behind a church. But, you know, those church graveyards got filled up, and people were buried on top of each other, and catacombs were developed, but still they kept filling up over the hundreds of years that these churches existed. So a little before the Victorian period, somebody hit on the idea of having suburban cemeteries, not associated with the church, but you could have a lot more space there. And those cemeteries were actually one of the things that they helped sell the cemetery plots was this notion that they would be fun places for people to come and have picnics and play ball and recreate in general. So that was a selling point for buy a plot in my cemetery. And that picked up a lot of speed during the Victorian era. You know, back then there weren't too many municipalities that had a Parks and Recreation department. They just didn't see that as being a core function of government. So there weren't a lot of city parks around in most places. So these cemeteries helped fill that gap for a while. And now they're not used so much for recreation anymore, but we have Parks and Recs departments and whatnot to take care of that. As another spin-off on the cemeteries is beautiful statuary in cemeteries. I mean, personally, I think some of the greatest sculpture that there is can be found in large cemeteries, and that is a hobby of mine. Okay, you know, I'm an end-of-life specialist, so don't be surprised by that. But yeah, I go to cemeteries and graveyards, and I do like to see the artwork that's there. Oh, something else that was big during this era was fear of being buried alive. It was a real thing. Here's a picture of a crypt, and you notice the handles They're on the inside, so that if a person is put in there and they're not really dead and they wake up, they can open the door and get back out again. Here's a schematic for a coffin that the deceased could open, and that addressed this fear of being buried alive. And of course, you know, if you bought a coffin like this, the person selling the coffin could tack on a few $100 more so that you could be assured that you wouldn't be buried alive. Now, I've puzzled over why the fear of being buried alive was such a big thing. It probably was a big thing because of what was going on in the literature at the time. Edgar Allan Poe, he was writing at the time, and a lot of what he writes about is, you know, not being dead. And Frankenstein, yeah, that was written back during this period. So whatever reason, that coupled with the casket maker's desire to tack on something and get a few more bucks, that fueled this fear of being buried alive. Now that, of course, was not real. It might have happened sometimes, but not very often. Like grave robbers, that was a very real thing during this period. They needed bodies to sell to medical schools for the medical students to practice on. And so grave robbing was an actual business. And too bad about that, but you know, it was real. And to combat grave robbers, they actually developed these what are called mort safes. See how this kind of ironwork goes over the top of the grave? Well, that was done to thwart any grave robbers who might be around. Now, a brief lesson in gerontology. I told you I'd like to go to grave sites and cemeteries and whatnot. And I do. As I drive around Pennsylvania, especially out in the rural areas, I'll see what's obviously a very old cemetery going back to the 1700s. And I'll get out and I'll wander around and I will look for tombstones and read them. And what I see is in any large graveyard, I am going to find people who died in their 90s and in their hundreds. And as a gerontology lesson, just keep in mind that people have always lived into the 90s and hundreds. It isn't that people live longer now than they did before. It's that more people live to old age now than they did before. The human lifespan of the species is 112 to 125 years of age. Now, another thing that I would often see is the biggest tombstone would be the guy, the head of the house. But then there'd be 2, maybe 3 smaller headstones next to his. And I'd read those, and invariably they were women who died at age 22 or 24. And the reason, of course, that they died is that they died in childbirth. So the old man, he would have several wives during the course of his lifetime. He wasn't a polygamist. It's just that he would have several wives because they would die in childbirth. And keep in mind, life's expectancy for women at this point in time is longer than for men. But back then, it was much longer for men than for women because of that. And another thing I would invariably see is lots and lots of very small stones. And the small stones were for the babies and the young children who died, because that was really where the death occurred, was in those ages. So go around, stop at an old graveyard and check it out and see if I'm not right about all of this. Okay, I would not be much of a sociologist if I didn't point out that there were big class distinctions during the Victorian era and the Gilded Age of funerals. So not everyone had a grand funeral. In fact, quite a few people were buried in mass grave sites. There were a lot of contagious diseases at the time. And, if yellow fever goes through, cholera goes through, tuberculosis sweeps through, and you're poor, you didn't have people mourning you. You just got picked up and dumped off in a mass grave site with as little ceremony as possible. Now, if you were a farmer and you weren't really rich, things were better than that. But it still wasn't kind of the grand kind of funeral that we were talking about. But, you would have a casket made, because caskets at the time, coffins. This is a coffin. They were less expensive at the time than caskets, and not quite as comfortable for the deceased to roll around in. And instead of having a big monument put up, you just have a wooden cross put up. And you go around in Pennsylvania, the wooden crosses in these old grave sites, they've disappeared. But you know that that's where they were just because of how things are laid out. So in the big cemeteries, the rich people, they had elaborate statuary. And one of the philosophical beliefs that this ties into is the notion that a person doesn't die until no one says their name or thinks of them again. And so if you build one of these marble headstones or statuary things that last for thousands of years, that's one way of having eternal life. It's the problem with the wooden cross is that it just doesn't get you there for eternity. So if you want to live forever, you better do something in stone that's going to keep you alive. Okay, so the Victorian period, it was a very romanticized period in a lot of ways, but in death as well as other kinds of literature and in art. So here's a little poem by Emily Dickinson that I like, and she was a Victorian era writer. because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. Wow, I think that's beautiful, and I think it's powerful. And writing like that was very popular at the time. And artwork like this was very popular at the time. You see lots of angels and lots of cherubs and, these young little angels. They're there at the, well, this would be a graveyard because it's behind a church, but they're going to carry up their little brother or sister up to heaven. And it's nice, it's nice and calm and peaceful. Here's my favorite epitaph of all, but and you do see it on Victorian tombstones quite a bit. It's popular there, but it actually traces back to the Roman era, and it's been translated from Latin, at least versions of it, but it's stayed pretty much the same, and I think it has such a powerful message. Remember, we're looking at a tombstone now, and it says, "Remember me as you pass by, as you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Therefore, prepare to follow me." Okay. Am I the only one who thinks that was really cool? So I'm done with my presentation, and we do have some time now. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Barbara, maybe there's been some questions, and we'll get out of here.
Well, thank you, Glenn. That was simply fascinating. Unfortunately, there is apparently no chat function for anybody to ask questions.
Oh, nuts.
Nuts. But I will encourage anybody who has questions to perhaps stop by Fort Hunter when we open again in May and leave a question for Glenn with the docents and take a tour while you're there. And then we will make sure he gets it and give us a way to contact you, and we'll get back to the question. And I do think our representative from Dauphin County Parks and Rec, Kate Shimana, is going to tell us a little bit about the cemetery and macabre tours that we do have at the mansion at Fort Hunter.
Yes, thanks, Barbara. I just want to give a plug for some of our specialty tours that we do. Throughout the year, we offer cemetery tours that leave from the mansion and walk to the McAllister Family Cemetery, which is about a 20-minute walk to the far end of Fort Hunter Road. We do offer that 2 to 3 times a year. We have not selected dates yet for this year, but keep an eye on the website. We will be posting those. And in October, we again are going to bring back our macabre tours. Those are going to be a Saturday evening tour, so you'll get to see the mansion after dark, which is in itself is a treat. But we will be talking about these same topics. We'll be talking about funeral practices of the Victorian era. In that tour, we do go more into grave robbing and the foods and all different mourning etiquette. And that is most likely going to be towards the end of April, or October, right before Halloween. So again, check the website for information on that coming up soon.
Thank you very much for all that information. And again, since I can't type it in anything for people to see visually, the website is Fort Hunter, FORTHUNTER, one word, .org. And you'll be able to find events, a calendar, the archive of past talks, and this one will show up there pretty soon. And you will get, since you're a registered listener, since you're here at the moment, you will get an email with the link to this talk as well. someone who I can't identify because they've texted me directly has said how interesting you were, Glenn. So thank you for that. I'm sure that person is speaking for all of our attendees, because I personally found that all fascinating. And I too have a little bit of time spent looking at cemeteries and looking at kind of the different social class and so forth. It is fascinating to see how those things have changed, and certainly how different we are now, because people get scattered to the wind, get thrown in the Atlantic Ocean, or put on their favorite ball field, or you can now be a tree. There's a variety of death disposal options besides cemeteries and graveyards and so forth. So all of that was fascinating. And please stay tuned to the Fort Hunter website and other ways you get information, the Dauphin County Parks and Rec announcements for when we will be able to schedule the Eichelberger Distillery at Dill's Tavern talk, because that will be hopefully our next program. So thank you everyone for joining us, and take care. Have a great evening.